Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another video. As you can probably already tell, this is going to be a little bit different because I've had a lot of requests from people asking me to explain the terms and the techniques that I use in some of my analysis videos and also show the techniques that a lot of the top players use. So I'm going to be doing that in this video, and also for players out there I will be explaining the techniques, and because I've been teaching professionally for 15 years, maybe I'll be able to point out some things that you might be struggling with or the reasons why you might be struggling with a particular technique. And before we get started, just to explain that this isn't going to be an A to Z of techniques because that would take all year to do. I've just been taking requests on Patreon from my patrons and they've been asking me about the techniques that they want explained, but also I'm going to put in the ones that I think are most important and the techniques that you'll see most of in the top players in the videos that I analyze. So the first technique we're going to get into is the one that I mention all the time, vibrato or vibrato, depending on where you're from. And this is the technique that gives a player their expression and their sound and a sound of control when they're playing. And just quickly before we start, tremolo is not vibrato. It's one of those things that gets mixed up all the time. I think the confusion started where guitar companies would call the whammy bar on their guitar the tremolo arm or the tremolo. And the difference between the two is, I'll start with vibrato. You can hear it's a change in pitch of the note. It's not just a straight note, the pitch is changing, whereas tremolo is an increase and decrease in volume. If I was to do a quick example of that, it means that the volume is pulsing in and out. So that's the difference between those two, and they get mixed up all the time. So getting into the technique and the way that you achieve it on the guitar, we're playing the string and then changing the pitch of that string. Kind of like that. So what's happening in super slow motion is I'm bending that string up and down and getting a smooth wave from that sound. That's the goal in order to get a nice controlled vibrato. And you can have different speeds. You can have really fast, which is uncontrolled sometimes and sounds a little bit nasty. It's one of those things that, in my opinion, having that really fast, uncontrolled vibrato, I don't like the sound of that. I prefer to have a nice, smooth vibrato. Again, it's all down to personal taste. So the vibrato that I'm demonstrating at the moment is known as a blues rock vibrato. Kind of like that. We've also got a classical vibrato, which obviously is used in classical music on classical guitars, and that is just from side to side. As you can hear, it's a lot more subtle. But the blues rock vibrato is the one that you'll see most players using. There is another one called circular vibrato, which is a really subtle vibrato. You sometimes see Steve Vai playing with that vibrato. Again, it's like the classical side-to-side vibrato, just really subtle. Another thing to mention is that you might see a player pushing up on the string to get their vibrato or pull down on the string. Whether you prefer to push or pinch the string, it's up to you, whichever you find most comfortable. What you'll tend to find is that on the lower strings, it will start to be a bit of a pinch because you don't want your playing to go off the fretboard. So if I'm going, that little bit of vibrato on that G, if I was to push that up, I go off the fretboard. So I pinch down for vibrato on that low E string, sometimes on the A string as well. As you get higher up the guitar, if I'm going, once you get to that high E string, you want to push up, because if I go and pinch down, I'm going off the fretboard again. And the next technique is hammer-ons and pull-offs. This is something that I mention all the time as well, and this is pretty easy to explain because when you're playing the guitar and you pick a note, you get that sound, and if you pick another note, you get that sound. So if I'm picking those two, you can hear those picks. A hammer-on and a pull-off is getting the same sound or attempting to get the same sound by hammering onto the string. So I'm picking the first note and I'm hammering on with my third finger. I didn't pick it, but you still heard the note. Like that. That's a hammer on. Then pulling off is when you pull off the string and you use the sustain that you've got from the previous note. Like that. Pulling away off the string is called a pull-off. And somebody asked on Patreon, how do you get your hammer-ons and pull-offs to have the same volume, sound the same as your picked notes? So when we've got those picked notes, you want to try and get the same volume, the same sound between those two. And what I would suggest is, first of all, your hammer-ons have got to be really solid in terms of coming down onto that string with force. You can hear that when I'm picking that string, the hammer-ons are about the same volume as my initial pick. And exactly the same is going to happen when you pull off the string. You want to really pull off with some force, and the direction of the pull off is really important here. What a lot of people do is they pull off too vertically, so going, and all they're doing is taking their finger off the fretboard, whereas what you want to do is push into the guitar and pull down and try and pull in to the string underneath, that E string. So the E string underneath, from the B string here, if I wasn't muting that, this is what you'd hear. I'm pulling off into those strings, but because my first finger's muting it, we're not hearing the E string at the top, and I can really push into the guitar and pull down. And it's all quite messy when you've got those other strings ringing out, and that's why with that first finger you find that position, and then you can really push into that guitar and pull off that string and not worry about hitting that high E string because it's muted. And you'll start to be able to get a consistent sound with your hammer-ons and your pull-offs and your picking as well. And just a quick example of a hammer-on and a pull-off run. Something like that, where you get a really nice smooth sound. And when I'm talking about players using hammer-ons and pull-offs and the legato sound that they can achieve with that, legato means long and smooth sounding. That's what I'm referring to, these hammer-ons and pull-offs that are less aggressive than when you alternate pick runs. And this leads us on to alternate picking, which is as it sounds. We're just alternating the picking on this right hand. So if you put your focus on that right hand, you can see how I'm picking every single note of that run. Kind of like that. And when you have hammer-ons and pull-offs, you get that smoother sound. What tends to happen with alternate picking is it becomes more important on acoustic guitar and really clean tones because you don't get a hell of a lot of sustain on the notes that you're playing. Obviously on acoustic guitar you're not going through an amp, you haven't got distortion or any sustain at all, you just have to make do with the strings. So you have to make sure that you alternate pick as much as you can, and on electric guitar it's a lot easier because you can use hammer-ons and pull-offs rather than having to really accentuate all of those picks. And it's just one of those things that depending on how you want to sound, you can work at your alternate picking or you can use hammer-ons and pull-offs, it's up to you. And then we get into tapping, which a lot of people will associate with Van Halen and a lot of 80s players, but Van Halen really brought it into the mainstream. And tapping is basically putting a hammer-on and a pull-off in with your right hand. So if I'm playing these notes with my left hand, doing a hammer-on and a pull-off, like that, and then I tap in with my right hand, that's all that's happening. And I'm using exactly the same technique with the right hand as I do with the left hand, in terms of I'm hammering down and then pushing down and away with my finger. Some people pull up with their taps. It's just up to your personal preference. And tapping is one of those techniques that I spent a fair amount of time working on because it was part of the sound that I liked in the 80s, and I wanted to have that as part of my arsenal. But like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, just work on the techniques that give you your sound and make you sound how you want to when you play the guitar. The other thing that you can do with these techniques on the left hand, introducing more fingers means that you're going to get a more complicated sounding run. For example, and as you could see on that run, as I work my way through it, I use the second and the third finger on my right hand to get a hammer on and pull off there, which will make it sound a little bit more fancy and a little bit more 80s. You can also do slides with the right hand. That's something that you might have heard before. Kind of like that. So there are things that you can do with these techniques to just make them sound how you want to, even make them more complicated if you want to as well. You can also tap onto open strings as well. Some players, especially acoustic players nowadays on YouTube, are tapping on to open strings and multiple strings. If you're tapping onto an open string, you'll get that kind of sound, and all that's happening there is I'm hammering on with my first finger, my third finger, and then the second finger of my right hand, and then pulling off all the way back down again from that second finger to third finger to first finger to open string. Kind of like that. And again, it's one of those things you can spend as much time as you want on tapping. I don't want to get distracted with it in this video, but we're going to be moving on to the next technique. The next technique is pinched harmonics, and I'm going to keep the tone that I've got just to show the difference between the two. A straight note, or a straight pitch note, will sound like that. A pinched harmonic will sound like that. And all that's happening is that I'm picking the string and then following through with my thumb straight afterwards. So I'm stopping the string from vibrating, and that produces that overtone of that harmonic. We also have natural harmonics, which are ones that you don't have to have any fancy technique on the right hand. You can just find them in the guitar, typically 12th fret. We also have natural harmonics, which happen just by themselves. You don't need any fancy techniques with the right hand. There is a little bit of technique to the left hand. When we're playing them, I'm just going to play them at the 12th fret, probably the easiest place if you're starting with these. And what I'm doing there is just resting my finger on the string, and then removing my finger when I'm picking the string. The left hand leaves that string a fraction of a second after I picked it, so therefore stopping the vibration of that string. And if you are trying to get these harmonics, just make sure that you're right over the fret, and in terms of the silver line, the fret divider, that's where you want to be on top of, not in between like you would have if you were fretting a note. So once you're just hovering over that fret, that's where you'll find the harmonics. If I did it right between, you wouldn't really hear them at all. So just make sure you're hovering above that fret and you'll find them. And just quickly as well, there's another type of harmonic which is called an artificial harmonic, and you might see players doing that where they're playing a note with their left hand, and if you try and follow what I'm doing here, if I'm playing the open G, the harmonic is on the 12th fret, just up there. So it means if I want to now play the 2nd fret with the left hand, and now I try to play the harmonic with the right hand, it won't be there anymore. It will be 2 frets further up because this note has changed. So it means that if I take my 12th fret and then move it up, I can then get that artificial harmonic. And in terms of the technique involved with this, you just want to use either the 2nd or the 3rd finger to pluck the string whilst touching where the harmonic is with your 1st finger, and then just removing that 1st finger, and that will give you the harmonic. Kind of like that. And harmonics are one of those techniques that were used in the 80s with dive bombs. Another question that came up on Patreon is how do you do a dive bomb? And it's a combination of usually a pinched harmonic and then using the whammy bar, usually on a Floyd Rose, in order to go all the way down to nothing. That kind of sound, which is just synonymous with the 80s. But once you start adding in these harmonics, you get that kind of sound. And that's all it is, just pushing down on that whammy bar. I'd suggest that if you haven't got a Floyd Rose, don't do this on your Fender Strat or go too mental with it, because you're going to have some problems. It was specifically a technique that was used predominantly on the Floyd Rose because it was designed in order to do this. But that's all it is, and you can use it with chords or single notes or those pinched harmonics. The next technique is slides, and these are pretty self-explanatory. You can have slides over 2 frets or 1 fret, or all the way up and down the guitar. Kind of like that. The most important thing when you're sliding is just keep contact with the fretboard the whole time, wherever you're sliding to, and then wherever you're sliding back to from that position. And this brings me on to a question on Patreon. Somebody asked about pentatonic shape 1 and also the blues scale, and those are shapes that come up all the time during lead playing. And even though they're not techniques, I'll just quickly take you through them. A minor, pentatonic shape 1 is going to be the same for all of the keys. We're going to be starting on this low E string. And that's our pentatonic shape 1. Now when we add in the blues scale, we just add one more note in, and that is going to be like this. I just added in that blues scale note and tried to exaggerate it as well, so you can see the difference between that first version, just the straight pentatonics, and then with the blues note in there. And the reason that it fits into this section is because of the slides. Sometimes when somebody's playing through that blues, you know, the little slide in there that we have is the blues scale slide. And they might be doing it in the lower octave or even in the higher octave. So that little slide, as I said, you can slide over 2 frets or lots of frets or 1 fret. That slide over that blues scale is one that you'll see all the time from all the top players, and you can even fret that if you want to. By actually playing it with a little finger, doing hammer-ons and pull-offs. It's up to you how you want to play it. And the next technique is palm muting, and this is one of those where you have to look at the right hand, because it's when we rest on the strings to get a muted sound, and you can use this to either totally mute the strings or to keep some element of the pitch in there so you can hear the strings resonating but you get a muted sound. For example, if I'm just playing an A without the mute, I'm going to alternate between not muting and muting so you can hear the difference. And those are the difference between having open strings and muting. And you can see how you can still hear the A chord coming through my muting because I'm not totally on the strings. I'm down towards the bottom end of the bridge, just where the string meets the bridge, so you can still hear the notes. If I move up too high, you get absolutely nothing from it. You want to move that hand down until you get the desired amount of mute and chord or note, however you're playing it or whatever you tend to be playing at the time. But if I kept moving down, then I come off that bridge and we get that open string sound. And I'm using just the side of my hand here. I also fan out my little finger just to make sure I can get as much contact as possible on those strings so that I can mute them all if I want to. And when I'm playing lead, what will happen is the palm will just follow the pick. So it means that if I am playing, for example, on the G, my palm is resting on these lower strings. So there's nothing that can ring out in the background behind my playing. If I were to pick it, which would be a bit of a nightmare, but if I did, it's going to die straight away, so it shouldn't really affect my lead playing too much. Obviously you don't want to be picking the wrong strings, but sometimes when you haven't got that mute in place, if you are going for it on a string and doing bends or anything where you might be getting a bit of resonation or getting the guitar to move, you can start to hear strings just ringing out ever so slightly in the background. So you want to make sure that you rest on the strings that you don't want to hear so that the lines that you play are really clear and concise. And this takes me on to the next technique, which is bends, because over on Patreon somebody asked, how do you keep the other strings quiet when you're doing bends? And the answer to that is by when you bend up on the string, I'm actually collecting the other strings on the soft part of my third finger. The right hand is resting on these lower strings so that nothing else is going to be ringing out in the background. And if you've got a long nail, what you might find is that when you come down, you might inadvertently pluck the string as you come down because your nails caught it. Whereas you want to get the correct angle to collect the strings, and then as you come down, you don't get that plucking of any string as you come down. As a rule of thumb or a rule of hand, what you want to do is keep the low strings muted with your right hand, and when you are doing a bend, you want to bend up into those strings and just collect them on the fleshy part of your finger. So even if I'm actually hitting a lot of strings before I start my bend, just to give a percussive sound, but also to show how when you get good at this, you can mute the whole guitar apart from the note you want to hear. And I can even apply vibrato at the top of my bend without everything else ringing out and going crazy, because I've made sure that I've got that insurance policy of keeping everything quiet with the right hand on the low end, because those are the ones that are really going to ring out those lower notes. If you don't keep control of them, having this sound and being able to vibrato as well, it's all about keeping them muted. And just quickly, a pre-bend is where you do the bend and then pick like that, and that's just the opposite of a normal bend. Kind of like that. If you are at the point of getting used to bends, then the next stage really is trying to get the same vibrato, that thing that we mentioned earlier, at the top of your bends. So if I'm going, you can hear how that vibrato is consistent, even if I'm going. You want to have it in both places so that you can express wherever you are on the fretboard, whether you're at the top of a bend or on a fret. And I just changed fingers there because you should be able to do vibrato on all of your fingers, really. And the next technique is sweep picking. And this came up on Patreon. Somebody asked, is sweep picking and arpeggios the same? Arpeggios are notes of a chord. So the answer to that question is no, because you can pick out the notes of a chord. Sweep picking is a technique that includes arpeggios. So if I do a demonstration of notes of a chord, if I'm playing an A, those are my notes from the chord. That is called an arpeggio. But the technique I'm using in the right hand is sweep picking, because I'm sweeping across the strings on the way up and then sweeping back down again. And to begin with, what will happen is you can start with just a few strings. This is one of those techniques I haven't spent a hell of a lot of time playing because it doesn't fit into my style, because I can never think of these notes quickly enough to throw it into a lead. I tend to throw in notes that I can sing in my head first, and I'm kind of playing as I sing mentally. But going into the arpeggio, if I take 3 strings, that kind of sound, once you start speeding up, this is what a lot of sweep picking is, especially in the 80s and the 90s. It's just really sped up as fast as you can do it. And then people start to add in tapping as well. all that kind of jazz. Like I said, it's not one of those techniques that I've spent a hell of a lot of time playing, but the little that I have practiced it, I think that if I wanted to get it really fast, then I probably could do, but I don't really see the application for it in my music. If you do want to get into sweep picking, the important thing about practicing it is keeping it really evenly spaced, probably using a metronome if you can, unless you've got a really good internal metronome that you can be really strict with your picking. Try and keep it as even as possible. And with the top mainstream players, you tend not to see them playing loads and loads of sweep picked arpeggios, just one after the next. In fact, you don't see them at all really, especially in blues. You might see it a little bit in country, maybe those 3 strings. You might see one of those thrown in now and again. But in terms of the mainstream, there's not a hell of a lot of that sweep picking that goes on. One of the applications that you might find more in the mainstream is making the first note of a solo more dramatic by introducing a sweep over muted strings. For example, as you can hear, I'm playing 2 strings before I get to the first note that you can hear, just by muting them. Kind of like that. If I want 3 strings, it's going to make that first note that I do play more dramatic because it's had a little lead in. And just quickly, economy picking. This is one of those that gets thrown in with alternate picking. We had alternate picking earlier, where you pick the string, alternating the whole time. Economy picking is just how it sounds, being the most economical with your picking that you can be. For example, if I had a run like that and I wanted to get to the next string, I'm going in the wrong direction with my pick. Whereas if I change the direction to include a downstroke at the end of each run, it means that I can keep ascending through the strings the most economical way. I don't have to worry about going in the wrong direction with my pick. So that is economy picking. Another technique that pops up is hybrid picking, and this is when a player is playing with the pick and also the second finger and third finger from the right hand in order to accentuate part of the chord or part of the lead if they're playing a particular lead that might be, they're using, like I did there, that third finger to strike that high E string. The next technique is bar chords, and I wouldn't really call this a technique per se, but they can take a long time to get nice and clean. All it is taking a chord from the bottom of the guitar, like your E, and then moving it up, but then replacing the bottom of the guitar with your first finger, because as you move up, everything's got to stay the same. So it means all of these notes here have to follow up with the E. And these are bar chords, moving up the guitar. And it's the same shape the whole way up. Like that. If I was playing an A, I would now, as I move up, have to bring the bottom of the guitar up with me. And this is where sometimes you'll see somebody play an A with a barred first finger, which means that as you move up the guitar, you can now supply that first finger and again, same shape all the way up. Kind of like that. So another rhythm technique that pops up is fingerstyle, which is where you do away with the pick altogether and just play with the fingers on the right hand. But just as a quick example, on the right hand you'd have a pattern. Sometimes you have a pattern that has a bass note that is changing. Kind of like that. Another thing that did get mentioned over on Patreon was a capo and what it does, and capos are there to either give you voicings of chords that you can't play because you literally can't bar it, or in the case of a few professional musicians who have never mastered bar chords, they use a capo, because if you imagine an E down at the bottom here, it's nice and easy. you can play that shape. As soon as you want to move that up, say you want to do that in the G position on the 3rd fret, you now have to play a bar chord. Whereas if I get my capo and place that there, it now means that I can play the nice easy version of the chord, and I don't have to worry about bar chords anymore. And you can still play all of your shapes, G, and your D shape, and your A shape. Now of course, because the capo's here, this isn't an A, it's actually a C, because it's changed the pitch. And this is the important thing, that when you're using a capo, make sure that you're still aware of the chords you're playing and you're not always thinking you're playing an A, G, D. They do change as you move up the guitar. And the next term I'm going to talk about is power chords, and this is something that gets thrown around and a lot of people don't know what it means. So a power chord is a really basic version of a chord. Generally, this will be played with distortion and not something that you're going to see on acoustic guitars or clean sounding guitars, because you need the distortion to make 2 notes sound like a chord. And that is a power chord. All I'm doing is taking the lowest 2 notes from a standard chord, the root note and the 5th, and just playing those together. And the advantage that people have got by playing it that way, you can move it around really quickly. That kind of like that. You don't have to set your hand down in a bar chord position. Another thing you might have seen is adding that extra octave into this power chord shape, which will give you the root note, the 5th, and then the octave, like that. When you play that together, you get a slightly fuller sound. As you can hear with the overdrive, it really does fill in that sound, even though I'm playing a really basic shape. And the more overdrive you take out of the sound, obviously the weaker it's going to sound, because we've only got 3 strings sounding, and 2 if you played that original power chord that I was doing. But without that overdrive on there, you can start to hear it sounds a little bit weedy and not too much going on with it. So you need that overdrive in there to give you that sound. Unless you might be picking the strings out and you might have some chorus on that sound and a bit of delay, and that's up to you what you want to do with that clean sound. It's not going to be as obvious if you're picking out the strings, but obviously there isn't too many options if you're just picking out 3. You can try and make it interesting, but generally you'll want a whole chord position to be going on so that you get to pick all of those notes of the chord, that arpeggio. And finally, a question that we had on Patreon was about tones and what makes a good tone, and when do you need delay and reverb and other effects. And this is all personal preference, what you like the sound of. I personally like a thick tone for my lead sound. When I say thick, specifically I'm talking about having a good deal of middle in there as well as bass and treble. And on an amp you'll have bass, middle and treble, and tweaking those and trading off between one and the other will make your tone. That's what you will sound like. And some guys like to have a really piercing tone, in which case the treble, that top end, will be toned right up and they'll take out some middle and they'll take out some bass. Other guys want a bassy, a boomy sound, so they'll up that bass, have the middle in the middle, and then take out a lot of the high end. So it depends what you like the sound of. With the guitar, when you're playing on the bridge pickup is where we'll get the brightest sound. If I now take it down to the middle, in that middle section, you can hear how some of that top end nastiness has been taken away. Now, unfortunately on this guitar, or fortunately depending on how you look at it, I've got humbuckers in my bridge position and my neck position. So going into that neck position, isn't quite as a dramatic change in tone as you would get on, say, a Fender Strat. And this guitar is going to have a really thick tone all the way through because of the humbuckers that I've got on here. And just so you know, humbuckers are having two pickups right next to each other. It's like doubling the signal so that when you put overdrive onto that sound, it's got even more signal to work with, so you can get a lot heavier with your tone and with that distortion sound, because it's like having two signals instead of one on this single coil, which you'll see in the middle here. And you'll see single coils generally on Fender Strats. They just have 3 single coils, and you get a real variation on tone with those Fenders, and you do get a great variation tone here as well, but this is more geared towards the heavier sound. And just quickly, I mentioned about guitarists controlling their tones with their guitar and not having any effects on the floor or stomp boxes or anything else. And the way that that's achieved is with the tone. This is quite a heavy tone, quite distorted tone. So you can hear the distortion on there. If I wanted to get rid of that and roll off the gain from that sound and the distortion, I'd go to my volume. You can hear how I've taken a little bit of that sound out. If I roll off a bit more, it's taken even more of that distortion out. So by rolling off that volume, I've taken out that distorted sound. If I go back to 10 again, the distortion is back. So you've got a lot of options just on your guitar in order to change your sound. And this is something that you'll see top players doing between solos. They'll just slightly edit their tone by adjusting the tone on their guitar and the volume on their guitar. And also the guitar pickups going from, say for example, the bridge, like this, all the way down to the neck. You'll get that difference in tone that way. So putting all that together, it gives you a multitude of options just on your guitar in order to change your sound live without having to rely on a lot of pedals. The pedals, like delay and reverb, are going to embellish the sound when you're playing because they're just adding an effect after whatever you've played on the fretboard. And again, that's just due to taste or due to the composition. But thank you so much for watching this video, and hopefully I've managed to explain a few techniques so that you understand them when I reference them in the analysis videos. A massive thank you as well to the people whose names are running up the side of the screen here, because they are my patrons and they make every video possible that I do on YouTube. So thank you guys so much. You know who you are. If you want to get involved yourself, head over to patreon.com/Wings of Pegasus. And if I don't see you guys over there, and I don't see you at the next cover video, then I will see you guys at the next analysis video. Catch you then. Rock!